Thanks for that kind introduction, Olympia. Much appreciated. Before I get started, I'd just like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, the people who have been guardians of the land from which I'm recording this presentation, and also to all of those First Nations people around the country on whose land you might be listening to this presentation. Ensuring the sustainability of the NDIS is not an easy ask. It's not an easy question to answer for a number of reasons. Principally, though, the NDIS is an incredibly complex area, as you know. It's complex in terms of the types of services that are provided, the sustainability of which are absolutely crucial to ensure that we are serving and supporting some of the most vulnerable people in our country. But it's also complex because the NDIS is actually only part of the Australian Disability Services system. Indeed, it's a very important part, but as we all know, state and territory health services, education services, and a raft of other services are also part of the disability services system. And so while I'm talking about ensuring the sustainability of the NDIS itself today, really I want to take a systemic view, have a look at the entire system and to consider whether or not that system is being approached correctly in terms of ensuring sustainability for all of those people that require services and supports under the NDIS. To that extent, today, my agenda is to have a look at the background, to have a look at some key issues and also to consider prospective ways forward. So in other words, to try and come up with some ideas about how we might do things a little better in future, building on our experience and our research to be able to drive a better outcome for people under the NDIS, but more broadly in terms of the disability services system. That way forward includes not only sustainability, but also to efficiency and effectiveness in the context of providing services. To that extent, originally this lecture has been developed out of our white paper that was published in November 2019. It was called 6 Years and Counting, and it looked at the NDIS and the Australian Disability Services system. It was really looking at three things in the context of the system. One, where the NDIS fits in. Two, what are the deficiencies in terms of the NDIS that we really need to get hold of in order to make the system more sustainable? And then thirdly, what kinds of things do we need to do to move forward to make the system itself sustainable? The white paper has also subsequently been supported by a raft of green papers that have been developed that look at specific issues in the context of the NDIS. Things like data assets are discussed, as well as risk elements associated with things like service mix and so on. So it's well worth having a look at those items in the context of this particular presentation and to be able to perhaps consider looking at the resources on the Not-for-Profit UWA website to deal with that. So first and foremost, the background. As we all know, the NDIS was intended to replace what was termed a dilapidated state and territory system. Unfortunately, though, in the creation of the NDIS, we didn't really take a solid stock take of the system or build a solid understanding of what was being delivered well within those states and territories and what wasn't. Therefore, while the NDIS was intended to replace what was seen to be dilapidated, unfortunately, we didn't really have a full appreciation of what the system was and where the system was going. It did inject, though, significant funding into the scheme, as we all know, and that funding was very much needed. In fact, bringing the Commonwealth into the disability services system is a very critical aspect of being able to ensure there's sufficient capital being provided to run the system, to meet the demand that is out there, and also to make sure that there's opportunity for investment in the system to make it as efficient and as effective as possible. Of course, we can't forget that the framework was developed for choice and control, to try and deliver that choice and control into the hands of people that actually need those services and use those services. To that end, I think it's a really important consideration to think about choice and control, but in many respects, for some aspects of service delivery, choice and control can also be aspirational. And so choice and control has driven a lot of policy arrangements, but perhaps ineffectually in some service areas. And of course, in terms of disability services, that's what we call in economics a merit good. And a merit good is something that is provided by the government or supported by the government that is actually reasonable and necessary, as is the NDIS. We know that not only do we want to give choice and control, but it's absolutely critical that the government has some framework around how those services are provided to ensure they're reasonable and necessary so that there is efficiency and we're not losing taxpayers' funds. To that extent, of course, putting the NDIS in place was always going to be a challenge. I guess my argument here is, though, that in terms of that challenge, we haven't really considered the total disability services system, much less the NDIS itself and what it replaced. One of the things that has happened, though, is that there have been 82 reports written in relation to the NDIS since its commencement in 2013. So 82 reports looking at the various challenges, gathering evidence and data, and putting forward suggestions for solutions in relation to some of the problems that are enduring in relation to this scheme. It is really important, I think, that we take stock of those 82 reports, that we understand what the commonalities are between them in terms of the solutions being posited, and also that we use that evidence and also our experience to drive the future development of the NDIS and the Australian Disability Services system itself. To that extent, what are the key issues then that I'm focusing on today? Well, I guess the first key issue is that from a sustainability perspective, as we know, in 2018-19, there was underutilisation of about $4 billion in relation to NDIS spending. That certainly stands out as a very significant number, as I'm sure you're all aware. But not only is that a significant number, it's a number that suggests that there isn't sufficient supply in the market to be able to drive utilisation. Therefore, there would be people going without services and supports. A lot of those people are in remote areas, but of course, a lot of those people are also in cities, in regional locations and towns around Australia. The other issue is that with regard to regional and remote service delivery, those areas remain significant challenges for NDIS service delivery and more broadly for disability system delivery as well. The regional and remote service delivery processes, I think, are not able to be used in the context of the NDIS, in the sense that we know, for instance, that in remote service delivery, it's often much better to have a community level solution rather than an individual level solution. And we know that the NDIS requires or seeks to have an individual level solution in order to deliver that choice and control. That choice and control is commendable in the context of many cultural settings, but not all cultural settings. And so one of the main issues that regional and remote service delivery challenges identify to us is the fact that at the end of the day, we have a system that is not sufficiently flexible to be able to allow for these changes to be made at the local level. The administrative burden remains substantial, so timing for payments and other things, but also the reporting processes and what have you are also quite significant. This administrative burden remaining substantial is a really important issue for the sector in terms of service delivery for two fundamental reasons. One, of course, it takes time away from actually delivering care, but secondly, because the pricing under the NDIS scheme doesn't really cover off the administrative cost of delivery. And therefore, there is a real burden on organisations in terms of their capacity to be able to deliver their services. I guess all of this then comes down to sustainability at the end of the day. And there's two aspects to sustainability that I think are really important. The first one is that sustainability means that the system is able to deliver services efficiently and effectively. That is, that it should be able to continue to deliver those services in a way that is appropriate to the people that are receiving them, in the quantity, quality, timing, and number of iterations that are necessary in order to be able to deliver. In other words, while we often hear a lot of commentary around the sustainability of the NDIS and maintaining our funding envelope, so in other words, maintaining expenditure within the funding envelope, actually sustainability extends beyond how many dollars are spent. It actually, to be sustainable, means that the system has to be able to continue to deliver services in a way that makes sense for those people that are receiving those services in a fit for purpose way. So how does that come down to market economics and quasi-markets? And I wanted to raise this issue because I think this is a very good example of one of the key issues that are facing the NDIS and the broader Australian Disability Services system. In terms of market economics, we often hear about NDIS markets. We often hear about quasi-markets and pricing arrangements and so on. But I think it's really important that we understand exactly what's going on as opposed to what the rhetoric tells us is going on, because that rhetoric is actually driving decisions that people are making within service providers, and also drives commentary and policymakers. First and foremost, market economics is about meeting demand for the right price. That is, at the end of the day, an efficient market is not one that delivers all of the services that are required. An efficient market is one that delivers the amount of services for the price that people are prepared to provide those services, and that price has to be the same as what people are prepared to pay. In other words, there has to be an opportunity for there to be alternatives. It needs to work for it. For it to work, rather, it needs the consumer to be able to do without the good or service, while the provider needs to be able to charge what they want for it. This leads to market efficiency. So when we talk about Mars bars or motor cars or anything like that, we have a situation where there is probably unlimited desire to obtain luxury goods and what have you. But of course, the price prevents people from actually undertaking those goods and buying those goods. However, when we come to disability services, of course, it's not able to, for most people, they're not able to have alternatives. They're not able to go without the good or service, because they need those goods or services, those supports, to be able to support their daily living. To that extent, then, we find that market economics is actually not really a good structure to consider the NDIS delivery in. One of the things that is absolutely important is that elasticity of demand is not present. Elasticity of demand means that people can choose not to use the service. They can choose to take another service, or they can choose to take the service on the price that's being provided. People need the services. At the end of the day, that's why we have reasonable and necessary in part of the definition of services for the NDIS. It's because those services are reasonable and they're absolutely necessary to those people leading their lives. In economics terms, we need to think about that, because we are actually pursuing quasi-markets, or we're pursuing this idea of market economics under the NDIS and the broader Australian Disability Services system as if they are real markets. And that has some real implications, because it means that fundamentally we're probably not getting our policy arrangements right. We're probably not getting our commentary right in terms of how organisations should respond to the challenges that they're meeting in terms of the NDIS. Unfortunately, if we pursue quasi-markets as if they're real markets, then it's destructive to the system. Let's have a look at an example. This economics graph has been provided by the NDIS. It's been published by the NDIS, and it looks at demand and supply. And probably a lot of people in the audience have seen similar graphs in their undergraduate degrees or around the place. It's a demand and supply curve. Those curves that start at the top left-hand and go down to the bottom right-hand, sloping downwards, are the demand curves, while those curves that slope upwards from the left are the supply curves. As you can see, what the NDIS is saying is that equilibrium in the market was achieved where A is, under the pre-NDIS demand structure, and under the new structure, C is suggestive of where the NDIS will end up in terms of its equilibrium. Now, there's two major problems with this idea. The first one is that, of course, all of those people who have a requirement for reasonable and necessary supports are going to take those supports. So in fact, those demand curves are perpendicular. They're not sloped curves at all, because at the end of the day, those people need every one of those services. Secondly, it's unlikely that the price is going to drive that demand capacity, because in fact, those service users have to accept the price the same as the service providers have to accept the price. At the end of the day, we're expecting the price to actually drive behaviour, but in reality, it's going to drive contraction in the market, I think. Let's have a look at what the real economics of the NDIS is then. If we look at a normal economics graph, so the price up the left-hand side and quantity across the bottom, when we think about the demand is the heavy black line, then you can see that that is perpendicular, because the demand graph, or the demand curve, means that those people actually need those services. They've been registered in the NDIS and their plans have been approved. They need those services. On the other hand, the price line, the actual supply of services, needs to be reflective of the price that's actually being offered for those services. Now, there's two things about this graph. First and foremost, I think it's absolutely imperative to confirm that perpendicular line, to understand that everyone needs those services. There's not that level of control or ability of people to sidestep them or not use them. And secondly, because the demand side is a perpendicular line, it means that the market clears right at the very top. In other words, the market clears at the point where everybody has received services that they need to receive. And that's why we report on things like underutilization, because that is suggestive of a system that's not working. Let's have a look at it a little bit more closely. In terms of the price that NDIS is providing, and this is all figurative, obviously, to demonstrate, you can see that supply under the price goes a certain way. And then after a while, that price becomes unmeetable for a number of suppliers, and therefore there is a drop in supply, and so unmet demand under that NDIS price. I've also put NDIS price plus states, because some of the states are putting top-ups into the NDIS in order to ensure that there's ongoing supply, which I think is a critical issue and demonstrative of the fact that the pricing is perhaps not working as well as it could. What does it all mean? It means that at the end of the day, as is happening under the NDIS drawing that was provided before, there are going to be people that miss out in relation to services based on this particular pricing structure. The pricing structure is driving supply, but it's not driving demand, and therefore achieving efficiency in terms of the market is highly unlikely. There's also a couple of other things to be thinking about. The first one is, of course, it's a tripartite economic arrangement. In other words, we don't just have demand and supply, we also have a monopsonist in the shape of the NDIA itself. That is, that we have one purchaser in the market, and that one purchaser sets not only the price list, but also the types of services that are able to be provided. Secondly, it's all short-term economics. We are looking at the system in very short-term state, looking at what's happening on a daily basis, rather than considering what the system needs to look like to make it work in the longer term. There are many offerings, many services offerings, and so those products mean that this one curve doesn't meet all of those products, and indeed there will be a shape of different curves for different products, and we need to be flexible to be able to meet the product requirements in that regard. This view, or this priority of the economics, doesn't consider quality and risk in real terms, and particularly in terms of clinical risk, I think that's a significant issue. Okay. What about the NDIS and the Australian Disability Services System? So we've just looked at one key problem in relation to the NDIS itself, but the Australian Disability Services System has also some key issues with the introduction of the NDIS, because the NDIS has been developed as if the remainder of the system doesn't really exist. Retroactively, we've started to pull together some relationship building activities. We've done some work to try and get the state systems connected and articulated to the NDIS, but really there hasn't been a strong drive to attach the NDIS or place the NDIS in the Australian Disability Services System. The system, of course, is complex, and we've already talked about the complexity of the system, but the current framework doesn't work for four main reasons. The first reason is that the policy framework is not comprehensive. In other words, the policy framework developed by the NDIA deals with the NDIS, but really not much else outside of the NDIS. And given the NDIS is part of the Australian Disability Services System, I think this is a critical challenge. Secondly, there's a lack of a planned approach to the articulation of services. And indeed, we're seeing some of the articulations between services that were advantageous under the old system are being lost under the new system because they simply weren't taken into consideration during the planning of the NDIS and its implementation initially. There's no medium or long-term planning to give clarity and certainty. This is a really important issue for organisations that might want to invest to change their structures and to understand where things are going and what the end state looks like. It's absolutely critical, and we know through our economics evidence and through research in economics that organisations invest most, plan most, are committed most to a system when they actually understand what the long-term objective looks like and how they can contribute to that long-term objective. And of course, it reinforces the short-term focus as no future state described and no investment supports provided. So we're doing a lot of tinkering around the edges of the NDIS, but no real reform in terms of pricing and other structures to articulate the NDIS into the Australian Disability Services System. So the economic model has given precedence over the policy and planning framework to the detriment of the system. So what are some of the ways forward? I think there's a number of things that we can do that are very practical and that would help at the end of the day to maintain a sustainable NDIS and perhaps more importantly, a sustainable Australian Disability Services System. First and foremost, I think we need to heed the experience that's actually been achieved within the sector and across the sector up to date, and also to heed the research outcomes. As I said, 80 odd reports have been written. Certainly not all of those reports will be right necessarily, but after the development of 80 odd reports, I'm sure we would find that there would be some nuggets of gold in those papers that would allow for people to be able to come up with some answers and to explore ideas. We certainly need to develop a fit for purpose approach. And this requires flexibility in the system at the local level, and it allows for, or should allow for, that fit for purpose approach to be developed depending on the needs of the individuals and how those individuals consume their services and supports in the context of their culture, location, and so on. So to that extent, we need to also develop a culture of clarity, certainty, accountability, collaboration, and flexibility. I think clarity and certainty I've already spoken to in terms of letting everyone know exactly where the end game of all of this development is going to be, not in very general terms, but in very specific terms about how this is going to work, and also to ensure that there is transparency over data so that everyone can see that the NDIA is accountable, that collaboration is real, and that both the sector, the NDIA and the service users and recipients are collaborating effectively in the development of the service. And as I said before, flexibility is absolutely critical. We need a comprehensive industry plan to that extent then, so that people can understand where their particular organisation might fit in the national plan, so that we can understand how things are expected to work at the national, state and local levels, and so we can see how the Australian Disability Services System is articulated, including in the context of the NDIS. And of course, we need a national governance model. And that national governance model doesn't just mean having a board of NDIS, it means having a national governance model for the Australian Disability Services System that includes government, the sector, the service delivery sector, and also advocates for service users. Additionally, I think we need a local decision-making model providing for purpose allocation of resources. At the moment, we have a centralised model, and we know that a centralised model doesn't work, particularly when it's centralised from at a national level in Australia, even as opposed to a state level. And so we need a local decision-making model providing for purpose allocation of resources, depending on where services are provided, what services are provided, and what the particular challenges of that location might be. That doesn't mean that that decision-making shouldn't be bounded, that the decision making shouldn't be subject to a accountability process. It should, but at the end of the day, the decisions need to be made as close as possible to the person receiving the care in order that they truly have choice and control. We also need transparency of outcomes to ensure we are all working toward the same future state. That transparency doesn't just include things like how much underutilisation has occurred, but at the very local level where the challenges are and how we deal with those challenges. That's really all I wanted to say for today. As I said, all of our materials is on the can be found on the Not-for-Profits UWA website. Please get in contact with me if you would like the green papers or any other papers. I'd be delighted to deliver those. Other than that, thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it, and I hope you found those comments useful. Cheers.